Welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast, where we break down the practical strategies of this emerging science, starting with healthy light habits and going wherever the quantum superhighway takes us. This is your host, executive and life coach Meredith Oke, with a quick reminder that podcasts are conversations, not consultations, and definitely not medical advice. We're here for informational purposes only. To follow up with our amazing guests, please do check out the show notes, and to stay in the loop with the QBC podcast, join our email list, also linked in the show notes. All right, everybody. Hello. If you are thinking about taking the Applied Quantum Biology certification over at the Institute of Applied Quantum Biology, now would be the time to dig in. If you're not on the wait list, please add yourself. If you are on the wait list, please check your email. We are open for registration. It's going to be a fun one. Do check it out. Just a reminder, this is a education program for practitioners. It does lead to an optional opportunity to write a board exam and become a board certified applied quantum biology practitioner. So that's super exciting. If you want to check out what you need for all of that to happen in your life, if you're a practitioner, please go to iaqb.io or qbcpod.com. It also links over to all that information. Or shoot us an email, support@quantumbiologycollective.org. Any of those places, we'd love to hear from you and help you, point you in the right direction to whatever you need. If you are not a practitioner, but you want to hang out with them and ask them questions, please do join our new community platform. It is free. Again, go to qbcpod.com and it will link you where you need to go to do that. We've got some fun events coming up this month, and it's all free and it's all fun, and it's just to have everyone get in the mix so we can see you and hear you and talk to you. All right. So, I don't even know where to start with today's guest. It is such an interesting story. So Tim Hammond is an intelligence analyst, and he worked for the United States military. And he had a very intense and important job, which we get into in the beginning half of this interview. The life circumstances and the requirements of that job led him to develop a very serious chronic illness, Lyme disease, with a lot of complications that lasted a long time. So his story reminded me a little bit of Deanna Wands, who I spoke to a few episodes ago. She had a career as a scientist in the military. So they had different jobs, but the kind of pattern of really super intense and important and unceasing work in, conditions that are not conducive to biological health, followed by an awakening due to prolonged chronic illness. So Tim was very forthcoming in answering all my questions about the intelligence community and how it works. I know that those words trigger in a lot of us suspicion and skepticism as to their motives and their role in the world. So it was really interesting to me to talk to someone who worked in that world and to hear about the important good things that they do, and how, it's always just comes down to our humanness and our humanity in terms of where things fall. So I love that we got into that, because I think it unpacked a topic that is a little, I don't know, maybe scary for some of us to think about, which is how intelligence is tracked all over the world, including all the things that we do online. And then Tim and I got into his journey with Lyme and how it has brought him to a very deep quantum biologic perspective. And Tim's really good at explaining the science behind everything. So we get into that. And then at the end, he circles back around to the connections that he's made from studying at the Applied Quantum Biology Institute and with mentoring with Dr. Jack Kruse. And he talks about light and Lyme in a way that I have never heard before. It's really cool. So buckle up. This is a good one. They're all good. I don't know. I say that every time, but it's true. And of course, please do visit our brand partners over at boncharge.com. And this is a good time to get a stocking stuffer. You know, it's a really good stocking stuffer is the little clip-on light that's red. It's like, it can be a flashlight or it can be a reading light. And it's just such an easy way to mitigate having to turn on anything bright after dark, which, as we all know, is very bad for us. So that's boncharge.com, and QBC is the code at checkout. All right, everyone, enjoy. Hey, Tim Hammond, welcome to the QBC podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Okay, I'm excited to talk to you because you have a job description and a job title in terms of your professional background. We'll get into your health background as well, but I did want to start with your professional background because you work in an area that I have to say my main familiarity with was through following the Edward Snowden story. So it's you are an intelligence analyst. And, you know, I think a lot of us, A, don't totally understand what that is, and B, are a little afraid that people with your job are taking over the world. Tell us, like, just to start off, like, what is an intelligence analyst?
Well, it depends, right? So it depends on what sector you're talking about. There's intelligence analysts, there's business intelligence analysts who are looking out corporate competition and things like that. The type of intelligence analyst I was is called an open source intelligence analyst. And so we look at all sources of information to be able to put together packaged products for particularly military clients in order to arm their decision-making capabilities. So the main goal of an intelligence analyst is to be able to sift through all of the information that's available and then transform that information into what's called actionable intelligence. In other words, you can use data scraping technologies to get all the information on the internet, but then you're inundated with so much information, you don't know what to do with it. So it's the role of the intelligence analyst to transform that into intelligence that is able to inform decision-making processes.
That sounds like a lot of power.
It's not, in the sense that your job is to be as objective as possible. You're just relaying the information as you're able to absorb it and identify it. And then it is the power really comes into the people. How are they using that information? And then that's where things can get tricky.
Okay, so you worked in the military area. And yes, so I guess at its core, analyzing intelligence is just analyzing information and deciding and letting it inform decisions. So when it comes to the military, could you give an example without betraying any top secret clearance or anything? Could you just sort of give an example of what that would look like?
So I had a few different roles as a military contractor. I started out in my career as a Mediterranean analyst specifically. So in my first role, I would write weekly intelligence products for clients that were members of Special Operations Command. And so looking at the Mediterranean, the U.S. military creates an imaginary map in its mind, dividing different geographies into different sections where they have intelligence analysts typically focus on specific sections. So if we look at Europe, you'll have experts on European affairs, and this is all under the map of EUCOM. It's called a Geographic Area of Responsibility. And then you have AFRICOM for Africa and Central Command for the Middle East. As a Mediterranean analyst, I was in a position where I was able to offer some unique insights because it's a borderland between these areas of geographic distinction, right? The Mediterranean Sea is a place that is seen as just an open border between these geographic regions, but actually the Mediterranean Sea has been more of a bridge throughout all of history between all of these shifting empires and populations and security issues. And so in the context of what I was working with, we were in the aftermath of the uprisings that were colloquially known as the Arab Spring. And so there was a lot of foreign fighter transit to and from Syria. There was a lot of refugee movements across the sea from the Middle East and Northern Africa across to get to Southern Europe. And in that, there was a huge humanitarian crisis. So I started out as a Mediterranean analyst with a focus on the humanitarian crisis aspect, just tracking and reporting everything that was going on. And the reason I got into that is because I attended graduate school in Malta when all of this emerged, the Syrian civil war and everything. So I was able to get some insights on the ground by interviewing migrants and refugees in and out of detention facilities to really understand the entire journey it took for them to get there and everything that was involved with that. And then so I ended up being recruited because of that experience as a Mediterranean analyst to support Special Operations Command. So we would just put out weekly reports about kind of driving situational awareness. And this could be used for maritime rescue operations that are going on. It can also just be used for just understanding both the cultural, humanitarian, and security aspects of everything going on when you have so many movements. And so oftentimes the clients would be mainly focused on the security lens, but I tried to always kind of fit in the humanitarian piece as much as I could.
Right.
And then after that, I went to work for the United States Marine Corps. And I was embedded with them based in Quantico. And my job there was also as a Mediterranean analyst. And the job was to create courses and then instruct those courses as part of Marines' pre-deployment training. So before they went to anywhere within the Mediterranean basin, so Southern Europe, Northern Africa, or the Levant, the Middle East, they were required to go through these courses. And I was responsible for creating all of them for all of these countries across the Mediterranean. And some specialized courses focused on things like ISIS operations or the transnational migration and humanitarian crises that were occurring. So I instructed about 4,000 Marines during that time before their pre-deployment training, and just in hopes of expanding their awareness before we go into foreign operating environments.
I see. So it was part of your job in terms of applying the intelligence to help people understand what they were walking into when they were deployed to a part of the world they probably had no experience in. They'd never been there before. That seems like a pretty crucial piece of the strategy when you're rolling people out across the world.
Definitely. And so it also offered kind of a wide lens on things because we would focus on the local economies, the local political structures, belief systems, the geography, the physical geography has a lot to do with when you're planning military or rescue operations. So there was many different lenses through which we viewed any foreign operating environment or foreign culture. And so the whole aspect or the whole point was to, create a well-rounded image of things before going. And each branch of the military typically has, or at least as far as I understand, they have a center that focuses on this type of information and pre-deployment training. And so for the Marine Corps at the time, it was called the Center for Advanced Operational Culture Learning. And that's where I was a SME or subject matter expert.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. And I think it's really important to remember that everything, no matter what the association in our mind is with a certain term or a certain job description, there is almost always a really valuable and important application of it, as you have just articulated. And the reason I say that is because I think for many of us, I mentioned Edward Snowden earlier, we have come to associate the type of work that you did with spying and the proliferation of specific narratives that may or may not be true. Is that fair? Or is it fair? Because you've just described like some really important work that the world really needs. So I don't want to, keep a false judgment in my mind. So tell me.
I mean, all of it's true, right? A rainbow has many different colors. So obviously the work involved can be critical and important, but it can also be used with malicious intent. So later on down my career, I became more of and open source intelligence kind of generally and less focused on geographic regions. And those roles were really eye-opening to some of the things that you're talking about for me, because I ended up working for an international law firm where it was my job to lead for several years a complex international investigation into international disinformation campaigns. So really my day-to-day job was to find evidence, if it existed, that there was what's called inauthentic coordinated behavior happening online. So if there's any kind of actor, and the context for this, let me just explain, was that there was a specific country being, quote unquote, under attack from many disinformation campaigns from other countries. And so there was litigation in the International Court of Justice, and the intelligence reports that I would put together were used to support litigation in the International Court of Justice. So what we would see is bot accounts or fake accounts that are used to amplify somebody's voice, amplify somebody's narrative. And the goal here always was to, if I can start some flame online in the virtual space, and if that is able to bring in enough voices, we can kind of spill that over into reality. And now all of a sudden you have real life protests, real life violence. So it was always kind of the modus operandi to create this online flame until it's able to spill over into real life. And typically the way that happened is you would have some fringe narrative that would eventually get caught up in more mainstream narratives, and then it would spill over into real life. So I developed methodologies for being able to identify and prove the existence of networks of thousands of bot accounts that were engaged in coordinated inauthentic behavior, which is a violation of social media's platforms in terms of service. So we would provide that information to these social media companies to get these accounts removed. But then also these reports were put together, lengthy intelligence reports for International Court of Justice proceedings and things of that nature. So with that role, I was privy to seeing a lot more ways that state actors are involved in amplifying political messages with intent to manipulate public opinion, and the playbooks that they use to do that, and also the relationships that state actors would have with individuals in mainstream media outlets to push those narratives through for their side. And so it was an eye-opening experience to be able to kind of see that on my day-to-day.
Wow. It's a lot. It's a lot. And so the question that forms in my mind is, how does one, from your perspective as an analyst, differentiate coordinated bot created narratives to serve a specific purpose politically from a more grassroots movement that is growing up organically and legitimately amongst the citizens of any given country?
That's a really great question. And so there would be a whole series of points that we would look at to point in that direction to differentiate whether this was a natural grassroots movement or whether this was purposefully politically pushed out. So I guess maybe the most simple way to explain is if I took a timeline view and I captured all of the tweets that were using a specific hashtag. So in this example, let's focus on a hashtag that's being used. So if I can draw a historical analysis of how that hashtag was used, one of the giveaways right off the bat is if that hashtag just appeared out of nowhere with no historic antecedent of its use, and it suddenly had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views, doesn't necessarily mean that that's political or bot, but taking into consideration with all other things. So that's one sign. So if you're trying to look at what might be part of a coordinated effort, you might gather the data behind the use of a hashtag and just look at its historical usage. If it's a more natural grassroots movement, you're going to see a gradual buildup, or you're going to see use of it in the past. So let's say we see that big spike, then let's zoom in on that big spike and then start analyzing and looking at all of the accounts that are doing it. And so in many of these cases, early on, it was actually quite easy, quote unquote, easy to identify these because the bot accounts were so obvious. They're using inauthentic profile pictures. Their handles will have a lot of the same structure to them. They will have a lot of the same biographies. A lot of their tweets will be word for word exactly the same without retweeting others. So just lots of indications that there was a single user behind the pushing out many, many fake voices. So you kind of just zoom in like that and provide many different points that show that these do not exhibit behavior of natural individuals online. They more exhibit behavior of coordinated, inauthentic behavior. And you gather as many points of evidence for that as possible and put it all together in an intelligence report. They're typically like, if I was investigating any one given campaign, might be about 50 pages. And then that's pushed forward with a conclusion about, and if we were looking at something that appeared to be organic and natural, that's the finding too, right? It's really important not to have some biased witch hunt that you have to find evidence for what you think is happening in your mind. Even when supervisors, or particularly I worked with attorneys for many, many years, they would want to push you in that direction, where this is where the integrity of the intelligence analyst really matters. And if you're a well-trained intelligence analyst, I had the honor of being mentored by very senior members of the Central Intelligence Agency, and worked for them for a number of years doing private security operations across the world. So they were men of integrity themselves. I don't know exactly what they're involved in and throughout their whole career. But they instilled analytic integrity in me, and I always carried that through, and that often ruffled feathers, particularly if I'm working with, say, attorneys who want to push a specific narrative, and that oftentimes didn't make me the most popular person in the room, but that's okay.
Well, thank you for having integrity. And it's interesting to me that with all of this technological apparatus at our disposal and all of the different ways that we have of analyzing things and gathering information and communicating, it really still comes down to human integrity.
Oh, sure. Everything.
That's interesting to me because I think over the past few years, there have been more events where, normal people like me who maybe aren't closely watching geopolitical turmoil in all corners of the world are experiencing things in real life, in real time, especially during COVID, where we were prompted to ask these types of questions. And so it's very heartening for me to hear that this integrity is still the defining force of the education of people in your job, even though there are people exerting pressure, lawyers, I would imagine, politicians who would benefit from a certain outcome or a certain result of the information and might be pushing for that.
Yeah, but I view any centralized system that is exactly what you just said. So if we look at, centralized intelligence agencies or military operations or the federal government is one example. But if we look at centralized medicine, it's the same thing where in most cases, you don't have malicious actors going into these jobs with malintent and they're just evil people trying to do destruction for the world. Usually, I mean, sometimes that is true, but usually people believe that they're the good guys. And usually people enter these systems with the intent of doing good for the world. If you're a medical professional and you enter the centralized medical system, typically most doctors are wanting to help patients. They're wanting to do good for people. But then it's the system that's the problem, not the individuals. And the system is designed with poor incentive structures based on poor economic incentives. And incentives drive outcomes. Right. So it doesn't matter how good your personal intents might be, if you end up working for a system that will ultimately either corrupt you or just break down your soul and motivation. There are many doctors who want to do good for people in the world, but because of the system that they're in, end up just being incredibly limited and frustrated, and kind of held captive by the pharmaceutical industry and things of that nature. And I think that our centralized political and military structures are privy to that same experience, where it's just a challenge of centralization. Any centralized system is ultimately vulnerable to corruption because of these single points of failure. And I think that, in the quantum biology space, that's one of the beauties of it, is that this is decentralized. This is, you don't need to go through any centralized authority or intermediary to go out and reconnect with nature and experience the healing benefits from that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love it. And that's true. And that's also why I think it doesn't, learning this information doesn't fit into the existing structure, because there is no incentive. Nobody's profiting off sunlight yet. I'm sure they'll find a way.
Yeah. But I think
right?
that will change, because I think that it will become profitable to be healthy, become profitable to share information that actually helps people. If we look at regenerative agriculture, so this is another one of these decentralized movements. And in regenerative agriculture, they show and educate farmers how, by using regenerative practices that improve the health of the soil and increase the microbiome of the soil, then you don't need to spend as much money on chemical inputs like glyphosate and pesticides and herbicides that end up destroying the microbiome and poisoning society. Because that soil is rich and is able to retain water and is alive, you don't need to spend as much money on inputs of water. So there ends up being a financial incentive for farmers to switch from industrial agriculture methods to more regenerative. And I think that for most people, you have to get to that narrative of, okay, what's this financial incentive? And so I guess I'm seeing that in the regenerative agriculture space. I'm sure that we can get there in the healthcare space, but because things are so held captive and so corrupt, it might take a little bit longer.
Yeah, I think so. I think change within the current system is a long game, but as you were saying, and as what we're doing right here, right now, is creating alternatives outside of the system. We will all experiment with different ways of doing it, and the ones that work will gain some traction. And ideally, there will be really good options that don't exist, so that we don't have to wait for the system to shift. Because I personally don't see that happening in the short or medium term. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah.
So let's get into a little bit how you ended up. So you started out in centralized intelligence, like literally in the heart of the centralized world. You have now started a company called Regenerant, which is regenerative intelligence. I love that. So you're analyzing a new kind of intelligence now, Tim. Tell us how that journey happened.
Well, so I had a pretty successful career in all that space that I was doing, the intelligence work. I even did a lot of consulting for big tech, reviewing their privacy safeguards and helping them safeguard user data more effectively, because we saw what happened with the Cambridge Analytica scandal and all of that. So I had a lot of really interesting experiences through my career that I'm very grateful for. It was very difficult and challenging, but it enhanced my character. But through those, it was more than a decade, I just experienced regular health crashes. They would just hit me like these waves. And so I would push myself out of the dip just by running on adrenaline. So, there was years that I was doing 24/7 physical security operations. So I couldn't miss a ping on my phone or computer because it could be something that's related to life or death. And I think I was just running on adrenaline so hard that I would have to dig myself out of these kind of pits that I was experiencing with my health. And at the same time, I didn't have any answers from medical professionals for my whole life. I started experiencing health issues in middle school as early as I can remember, and was just diagnosed with things like failure to thrive. Or then for the years from then, I'd just be granted with labels that meant, okay, here's a description for a constellation of symptoms, but there's actually no explanation of what the root cause of that is, which is the vast majority of diagnoses that we have today. So not particularly helpful. Like if somebody has fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue or irritable bowel syndrome, okay, great. What is causing that? What can I change in my day-to-day life? What about my environment is affecting these things? But that education isn't there. So kind of had these waves, but eventually those waves just were crashing harder, and it was getting harder and harder to come back up to the surface. And I ended up feeling like all of my life's energy was just spent treading water and anticipating the fear and inevitability of the next crash and how I'm going to be able to keep working and how I'm going to be able to keep going when that happens. So it ended up just being very, very exhausting. So in 2017, I basically came to the conclusion myself that I think that I have Lyme disease. And so I ended up going and getting tested, and I was somewhat lucky off the bat, quote unquote lucky, that I got a very clear positive CDC diagnosis for it. So the diagnosis for Lyme disease is a clinical diagnosis. So any doctor can present the label to somebody based on clinical representation of symptoms. But that can get overused in some cases. Many functional medicine doctors, for example, might present that diagnosis to somebody without having actual hard, concrete proof that these pathogens are in the body themselves, because our testing methods are so ineffective. But for those who actually do have the disease and do have these pathogens, yes, it's very, very hard to get affirmation that that's what's going on because the testing is so poor. But I got a clear diagnosis of that. They called it a raging infection. It was very obvious. And I had many co-infections. So I'll just differentiate real quick. There's Lyme, which is named after a specific bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi. But in most cases, the people who are experiencing complex or chronic illness, they don't just have Lyme. They have a mix of various co-infections. So you might have Lyme, which you could call more accurately borreliosis, but you could also have babesiosis. And babesia is a malaria-like parasite that lives in your red blood cells, suppresses your immune system so that Lyme can kind of take over. And they all kind of work in conjunction with each other. Or you can have Bartonella, mycoplasma. So typically, if it's being carried by a tick, these infections all come together. And so each case of Lyme is going to be case by case individual. Each co-infection will cause different symptoms. And then these co-infections kind of take turns rising to the surface on which one is expressing symptoms at that time. And then if you're treating them, you might kind of treat the babesia, then the Borrelia has space to kind of move to the surface. Then you treat the Borrelia, now the Bartonella is coming. So what it leaves patients with is this experience of having no idea what's going on, losing their sense of reality, losing their sense of control, because their symptoms are all over the place. And if you ask one of them how they're doing or what their symptoms are, it's a little overwhelming to even try to talk about because they're going to sound quote unquote crazy. And for many people with Lyme disease, they're just constantly gaslit, just saying you're depressed or something, or that it's not real. So anyways, I thought that Lyme was the problem, and I had proof of these pathogens taking over my body and proof that my body was not able to create this environmental balance and deal with them on its own for whatever reason. And that started me down almost another 10-year journey of treatment modalities. So I went the pharmaceutical route, and for about 8 months, I was taking in total maybe about like 50 different medications and supplements per day. And just kind of pushing through this pulsed antibiotic therapy. But when you treat Lyme disease, you're releasing so many endotoxins that are very inflammatory, and you typically have an impaired detoxification abilities. Later on, and we can get back to this, but looking back, I had poor redox, which is where the quantum biology comes into play. If I had known about improving my electrical potential with increasing redox potential, my detox could have been more effective. But Yeah, I tried to really white knuckle it through these treatments and these very, very brutal Herxheimer's reactions, but it was impossible to work. So I did most of my work after the job with the Marine Corps all remotely. And so I have to be on Zoom calls and things like that, but I'd have to be hiding in the bathroom or just having to work on, from bed. And it became very, very unmanageable because I think people on the other side of the screen probably thought I was slacking off or just not being professional by showing my face, but I couldn't show my face. So it was very hard to manage. And it got to the point where I just didn't think that I would make it. I just didn't think I was going to live. And that's tricky. When you talk about Lyme, you don't want to sound like somebody who's being over dramatic about their health experience, right? Like at the same time, this is the experience that I had, and I can only compare it to itself. And it was very extreme and very, very isolating. And because that's not very widely recognized, I think the isolation from society is part of the worst aspect of any chronic illness. That was very hard to kind of climb out of. But from there, I just couldn't keep doing that pharmaceutical option anymore. My body was just being destroyed. And I didn't understand, I knew that a huge percentage of our immune system comes from our own gut and our microbiome. But if I'm taking all of these antibiotics and antimalarials and antiprotozoans, I'm just destroying my internal microbiome. And so what I really wanted to do was deal with things from a root cause. And how can I improve the health of my microbiome so that it can manage these quote unquote infections on its own? Like, why was my body unable to deal with these things on its own? And so that's what I really wanted to get to. So I ended up quitting that pharmaceutical treatments and shifting to more naturopathic, I guess you could say, modalities. But what I found was it was the same error of thinking, in that instead of throwing tons and tons of pharmaceutical medications at my body, they were throwing tons and tons of herbs and supplements. And so I would try numerous different supplement and herbal protocols for years trying with this, but it's the same mentality of something from the outside having to be inserted in, rather than examining what environmental conditions are needed to activate the body's innate healing capacity and innate healing intelligence. And so I just shifted away from kind of that naturopathic route. And over time, I was making the observation, it took about 3 years, that every summer, because I had this interest in regenerative agriculture, I was outside, I was barefoot, I was working with the soil and the dirt. It made me feel good to be improving the microbiome of the soil, because that microbiome is required for the plants to be able to uptake nutrients through their roots. And I knew that that's the same thing I had to do with myself. The soil is just the gut of the earth. And so I'm trying to heal my gut and my microbiome while healing it. I really developed this connection with the earth and with nature. And I felt so much better. And then winter would come. And I'm stuck indoors much more. I'm not under UV light. I'm not grounded. I'm under much more blue light, much more non-native EMF, working all the time. And my symptoms would always flare up terribly. So it took about 3 years of going through this cycle of summer alleviation, winter falling apart, for me to really explore that further. It was somewhat obvious. Okay, nature is healing. We all know that somewhat. Oh yes, nature is good for you. Why? Why? From like a very first principle. So as an intelligence analyst, a way of thinking, the best way of solving complex problems is through first principles, which is a model in physics that involves breaking complex problems down into their most basic components. So that's what I had to do. And if I wanted to analyze my own situation and fix my own health in that way, that naturally led from these biochemical models, which involved the pharmaceutical approach, the allopathic approach, the naturopathic approach. They were all working on the level of biochemistry and these external inputs into my body, which I don't want to just throw out. I learned many lessons from that. And it's not that any of that is wrong. It's all true. It's just not the whole picture. And so this connection with nature led me down to explore biophysics, which is a more fundamental layer upon which biochemistry is built. So if you're missing the biophysics piece, it doesn't matter how hard you're working on the biochemical piece. If your light, water, and magnetism environmental inputs are wrong, you're not going to have the success that you're looking for. So that led me to quantum biology and studying that.
Wow. What an amazing story. Yeah. And I have so much compassion for you in the time where you're feeling, you feel so terrible. And not only is the physical experience of it awful, but there's no support. There's nobody like, oh, he has cancer. Oh, right. It's like, what's wrong with you? Oh, I thought it was this. It's that. And just because we don't have the language, we don't have the context to understand the way our bodies are responding to this environment that we created like literally 5 minutes ago. Nobody understands. And so the people suffering are left, as you said, largely isolated. And it's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Thanks for taking steps to be part of the movement to change that. Okay. So I'm a physician. Let's say I'm a functional physician, just so I'm not like totally in the allopathic model. So I'm a functional physician and I'm like, biophysics, Tim, what are you talking about? Say more. I'm a curious physician, a rare breed. I'm kidding. Well, there's wonderful physicians that I've interviewed who are very curious. Okay. So tell me, Tim, biophysics. So what?
I would explain that I would probably start with light, how light, water, and magnetism really set the stage for biochemical reactions to play out. And so all of the biochemical reactions that are occurring in our body start with essentially light inputs. Photonic energy activation of jumping electrons up into higher orbital levels is what activates molecules for them to be able to participate in biochemical reactions downstream. And so we can go into many, many details of things, but what I guess what I would talk about is just that light has an effect on our biology because we evolved on a planet with exposure to a specific electromagnetic range of energy. And we evolved on a planet that is rotating and turns 12 hours towards the light of the sun, 12 hours away from the light of the sun. And I would start explaining the role of probably circadian biology first before I get into water or magnetism and these light inputs, and how I would explain how the light inputs through the eye set the body's suprachiasmatic nucleus, the body's master clock, to be able to distribute time information throughout the body. So why does that time information matter? Well, scientists first explored the circadian biology mechanisms by looking at plants. And so they would observe that a sunflower, for example, would actually turn and rotate its leaves, orient its leaves to the east towards the rising sun before the sun even rose. So they had to think that there must be some sort of circadian clock mechanism within the plant itself. And so now we know that there is, and that essentially drives everything. And so, for example, just on the photon information, biochemistry is looking at life at the level of molecular interactions, right? So that's where we get the pharmaceutical interventions coming into play, is they're working on molecular interactions. Biophysics goes deeper into looking at subatomic particles and how their interaction with biology looks like. And so we're talking about electrons and photons and how photons are captured by electrons in the body and what that leads to. So my kind of answer is a little jumbled and all over the place just because there's so many different ways you can go into it. You can go into the circadian biology and the light aspect. You can go into how we require ample pools of electrons because photons only interact with electrons. And so if you have enough electrons in your body, you can capture more photons, light energy. We can talk about the photoactivation of things like the conversion of tryptophan into serotonin in the retina and tyrosine into dopamine, and how these aromatic amino acids contain a benzene ring, which acts as a photon trap. And so photon energy from the sun gets trapped by these molecular structures, and then it jolts up the electrons that are orbiting the nucleus into a higher orbital state. It excites these electrons. And then that makes them biochemically active to start a bunch of downstream biochemical reactions that convert that tryptophan into serotonin and that tyrosine into dopamine. So if we're focusing just on the conversion of biochemistry without looking at the light that kind of activates the process in the first step, we're missing what kicks everything off, which is the light.
Right. So in the biochemical model, we're looking at the outcome, but we're missing the inputs.
Right. Right. So you can focus on food, for example. I'm somebody who I want to be healthy. I'm really focused on my diet, right? And this was me. So I had to cut out dairy, gluten, largely because of the glyphosate, all of these things. But how come so many people are focused so much on diet, feel like they're doing all of the right things and still not getting the outcomes that they're really looking for? Well, it's because we're not paying attention to our light environment. So for example, we now know that blue light, independent of food intake, increases blood sugar levels because of the way that it interacts with pro-opiomelanocortin, which is a precursor protein that gets clipped by blue light into ACTH, which raises cortisol and blood sugar. So, and meanwhile, we know that red light does the opposite. Red light is able to lower blood glucose levels. So if we are eating our food, even if it's really healthy food, in front of a blue lit TV in an indoor environment in which there basically is no red, and there likely is at this point zero infrared, then that's going to really spike our insulin levels. And so the environment which we're in and the light environment kind of dictates everything else. So food, it matters. Yes, all these chemicals that are in our food system, all of the glyphosate, and there's an increased wave of activism around this, which is really exciting to see recently. But what they're not getting is the light, and that the light sets the stage for all of it. And if you don't fix your light inputs, you're still setting this. You're kind of working against the grain for yourself. And if you fix the light inputs, if you fix your circadian rhythms, which all of your hormones operate on a 24-hour cycle as well. So your leptin, which manages your sense of satiety, your ghrelin, which is your sense of hunger, these are all circadian hormones. And if you have mismatched light frequency information by never seeing sunrise and exposing your eyes to artificial blue light after sunset, your body can't tell where it is in time, and your body needs to know where it is in time in order to cohesively operate all of these different systems. I have all these different cells, all these different organs, all these different organ systems. Well, how do they come together? They all have different jobs. How do they come together to cohesively operate it and this human body that I have effectively, right? So I'll go back to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in that is considered the master conductor of the orchestra. And if all these different instruments in my body are literally the instruments that make the music, if we have dysregulated circadian rhythms and chaotic light signaling from indoor environments, there's going to be decoherence. You're not going to be able, if everybody's playing on their own rhythm, then you're not going to be able to hear a coherent song out of that. It's just going to sound like a jumbled mess. And that's inflammation in the body. Whereas if we're able to couple all of these instruments to the same sense of time and the same rhythm, then they can operate together coherently and we can hear a clear melody. And that's coherence, and that's biological coherence. And what you need to do is get those light signals through the eyes, which can get converted by photoreceptors into electrical signals that travel to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which then its job is to distribute all of that light information to all of the cells in your body, which all have a clock gene. Why? Because they need to know where the sun is in the sky. They need to know what time it is to know whether to turn their activity on or off. So is it morning? Is there an increase of blue light in the environment? This means that I should activate the pituitary gland to increase stress hormones and cortisol and blood sugar and get me up and going for the day. Or has the sun now set and is there a diminished blue light in the environment, which switches off pituitary activity and switches on pineal gland activity to allow the release of melatonin, which runs apoptosis and autophagy. So everything needs to know this timing. And if they don't know the timing, which is all based on light cues, then you're going to be struggling with inflammation and dysregulated hormone balance.
Thank you. Brilliant. Brilliant breakdown. Okay.
It's tough because
The
there's
functional
so many
physician is
angles.
convinced. I know. I know.
We
And
could talk about
that's part of it.
exclusion zone
Yeah.
water and grounding and just so much, but it's all fascinating.
Yeah. It's all, and it's, we just, I think if once any one person can wrap their head around one aspect of it, it'll lead to the other and lead to the other and lead to the other. And light is, I think, the most straightforward place to start. And, as you talked about, it's free. You can experiment with it and you can just notice, like, how do you feel when you're in situations when you're outside all day, whether it's the summertime or you're on vacation at the beach or whatever, versus when you've been locked inside on a computer all day. Like, how do you feel? It's so clear. So tell me what changes as you integrated this information. You clearly internalized all of the science. I love it. How did you make changes in your life, and what does your health look like now, and what does your living situation look like compared to when you were on the clock 24/7?
So some of the just kind of practical changes that I made in my environment, you can see I'm wearing blue blockers. So I got myself some blue blockers that I will wear if I'm working behind the computer, to avoid some of this excessive blue light exposure that we're under from all of our screens and our LED light bulbs. It's most important to wear them after sunset, which I might switch to red at that point. So mitigating the artificial light was a huge piece, because if I am up at midnight and I'm looking at my phone screen and it's blue lit, well, that blue is this daytime signal. It's telling my brain, oh, there's blue light in the environment. It must be noon. So now my body has to think, oh, we need to reverse things, go back in time. It's noon, ramp up that cortisol, ramp up that blood sugar, and suppress melatonin. And with that suppressed melatonin now for pretty much the entire night, I might feel like I'm sleeping fine, but that melatonin isn't available to run the programs of apoptosis, which is programmed cell suicide, which is especially important for things like cancerous cells, to be able to clean them up and destroy them to make room for new healthy cell growth. And so blue light, this is why it's implicated in so many different cancers and the increasing cancer rate today, because we're inhibiting our own body's cellular repair and cleaning mechanisms at night. So blocking the blue and artificial light in general to allow my body that healing time at night was really important. Getting up and seeing sunrise. So if all of our hormones, neurotransmitters, and everything pretty much in the body is circadian regulated, because we evolved on this planet with day-night cycles, then seeing sunrise is important for resetting that clock in the brain and getting things all regulated to the same sense of timing. So kind of starting off, step one, fix your morning and evening routines. And then throughout the middle of the day, taking regular sun breaks, even if they're short, to get exposure to UV. So UVA, which we know improves especially our mood and our sense of drive and focus by increasing serotonin and dopamine levels, improving cardiovascular health by releasing nitric oxide, and then UVB in the middle of the day to allow for vitamin D and immune modulation. So a lot of people who experience autoimmune diseases, where essentially their T cells are running amok, well, in many of these cases, that's a UVB deficiency, because UVB modulates immune activity and suppresses the activity of these T cells. So the full spectrum of the sun really matters, because every wavelength from infrared, which is invisible, to the visible spectrum of colors that we can see, to invisible ultraviolet, each one of these wavelengths have an important role for the body. And the balance of them and how they dynamically shift throughout the day as the sun moves across the sky, that's what matters, because that's the electromagnetic environment, which light is electromagnetic energy, that we evolved under. So that's what we're adapted to. And the fact that we've made all of these light changes to our environment in just the last 150 years since the invention of electric light, we can't expect to make such dramatic changes to our environment without biological consequences. So if you think about it in kind of evolutionary terms, it may make more sense to people that, oh, of course, light has an effect on our biology. We evolved under it or its absence. So focusing on light environment for getting better was huge. Obviously, I did do some diet stuff. I removed gluten largely because of the glyphosate exposure, which glyphosate is just terrible. I cut out industrial seed oils and then learned that the reason why that matters is because of their high deuterium content. I also focused on what kind of took me the longest was electromagnetic environment, probably because everybody says that, oh, 5G is not bad for you. That's a conspiracy theory. And it's the most inconvenient, let's say. I used to love my AirPods. I used to love all my wireless devices and things because they were so convenient. But after learning the effects on the body, the way that it decreases alpha melanocyte stimulating hormones' ability to synthesize melanin, how it collapses the exclusion zones within your body, which is your battery because that exclusion zone water charge separates protons and electrons. Just a lot of really bad effects, right? Even though it's non-ionizing radiation, even though it's not heating up our tissues, it's causing all sorts of other things, particularly affecting the mitochondria, which are responsible for all of our energy production. So what that looked like was switching from wired devices back to wireless. Now I have a wired keyboard, a wired mouse, hooking my computer up to the Ethernet cable, turning off Wi-Fi completely at night. So at least at night, I have this window of time that allows my body to regenerate without these frequencies. Again, these are frequencies outside of that natural native electromagnetic spectrum for which we are not adapted because we did not evolve under those conditions. And so suddenly we've changed the electromagnetic spectrum on our planet. And of course, there's consequences for that. So these are just kind of some shifts I made, and focusing on water too, I guess, is the third pillar from the quantum perspective of improving the quality of the water that I drink so that and more importantly, improving the quality of the water I'm making, because we know that mitochondria produce water at step 4 of the electron transport chain. So by supporting and focusing on mitochondrial health, they're able to kind of run the show from there. They're able to create the water that becomes easy water. They're able to create the ATP, that's the scaffolding for that unwinding of proteins for the easy water to be built on. So, and I think that that's another distinction rather than focusing on the biochemistry that allopathic and naturopathic medicine focuses on. They also focus on the nuclear genome. Whereas in the quantum biology space, we focus a little bit more on the mitochondrial genome because our mitochondria have their own genome. There are kind of symbiotic life partners with which we're completely and utterly reliant. And so if you focus on improving their health, they're going to take care of so much more for you that you won't have to worry about, essentially.
A very strong recipe for nurturing our mitochondria, which is really important to everything. Thanks so much, Tim. That was super. I want to circle back before we wrap to your professional experience and weave it in. So you have, as you've just demonstrated, a very in-depth and robust understanding of biophysics, quantum biology, and how that all works. You mentioned a few minutes ago a new wave of activism around glyphosate and all of the other additives in our food supply, which I think Casey and Kelly Means have done and are doing an outstanding job of educating the public. I just am blown away by their knowledge and passion. That being said, whenever they get traction, largely on podcasts and social media, I do also see blowback or debunking type articles show up in places like The Atlantic. So through your lens of an intelligence analyst, of someone who also has a really deep, robust understanding of how information can be manipulated, I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we go from here and how we share this information in a world where there is such a sophisticated level of manipulation and silencing of dissent.
Great question.
Just that. That's it. Just a small wrap-up question.
So my advice would be if you're trying to sift through all of these complex narratives and you're just trying to figure out what's true, so like, what can I do that's actually actionable in my daily life, which is all most people care about. I tend to like to go into the complex science of everything, but most people, they don't care. They just want to know, like, tell me what to do. If you're hearing these competing narratives, try to examine what the incentive structure behind that specific narrative is. And if there is financial ties, financial motivations for that narrative to be pushed through. So if it's coming from Kellogg's and they're giving pushback, well, obviously that's a biased narrative right off the bat. So take that into consideration. And if you're hearing other information where there actually doesn't seem to be any clear incentive structure where this would financially benefit them from sharing this information in any way, maybe start digging into that a little bit more and following that trail and see where it goes. Because if that information that is being offered for free with no clear ties to financial boosting of any given parties, it might be more aligned with the truth without interventions of like financial incentivization. So I think that that's what my general advice would be. If you're trying to sift through narratives, look at who is saying point A, who is saying point B, what organizations are they tied to, how are those organizations funded and getting their money. Unfortunately, that is just the reality that we should look at, and that might help people kind of assess truth for themselves and become their own researchers in the world.
That's a really good way to look at it. And I agree, we do need to become our own researchers. Just like there's no world in which we can be like, yeah, I don't need to think too much about my health. I'll just like eat good food and it'll be fine. It's like too late. We have to. And I think the same thing with deconstructing information. Like, yeah, it would be nice if we could have a few institutional resources that we trusted and that would to tell us the truth, and that would be that. But that's not where we're at as a society currently. It's requiring work. So I try to find individuals that I trust, and I would say almost all of them work in independent media or are independent of any kind of major corporation. But it's tough. It takes up a lot of time. And, something that I think I learned from Callie Means, who worked as a lobbyist inside the pharmaceutical industry for a while, like he made the point that Pfizer buys all kinds of ads on all kinds of media, not because they work, not because it extends their market, but because then the companies are financially reliant on them. So that's so to your point, like that is following the money.
I did want to offer a little more specific information on Lyme, if we could circle back.
Sure.
Because I talked about kind of the general changes I made to my light, EMF, and water. I want to explain what Lyme does.
Okay, tell us.
Essentially, Lyme disease tricks your body into thinking it's in an environment of perpetual scarcity. And there's a complete lack of abundance. And it is always winter, it is always cold, and it is always dark. The way that it does this is it keeps your body stuck in metabolic programming called AMPK, which you might consider as your winter metabolism. So AMPK is something that's good because it's activated by a lack of ultraviolet light in the environment, a lack of nutrient availability. So this will switch on typically in a winter environment if you were attuned with this changing seasons, that is, in order to not focus so much on energy expenditure or muscle growth or protein synthesis, but instead on rest and rejuvenation and cleaning up what you can, apoptosis, autophagy. So it has an important function, right? Whereas the antithesis, the opposite end of that scale is mTOR. This metabolic pathway is you can think of it like your summer metabolic programming. And it's activated by higher ultraviolet light conditions, which lead to higher nutrients and carbohydrates available in the environment. So you can focus on things like growth, acute immune function, protein synthesis. And your body's never in one or the other. Every cell has an activation of these programs. And so it's a shifted in one direction or the other, let's say. So Lyme keeps you in AMPK activation. So it keeps you in this winter mode. And the reason it does that is because that essentially acts as immune suppressant. Because if your body were activated by ultraviolet light to be in mTOR mode, then it would activate acute immune activity that would threaten Lyme's ability to perpetuate in the body. So it manipulates the metabolic functions of the cell to create an environment in which it can thrive and go more undetected. And something even more evil that it does is
Wow.
Lyme disconnects you from the ability to connect with the benefits from the sun. And it does this by reducing alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is what is required for the production of melanin. Melanin, we know, it's a transducer of electromagnetic energy, which means it can take in ultraviolet, convert that into heat or infrared so that it acts as our natural sunscreen. But melanin is also responsible for creating the DC electric current that our cells rely on in order to operate our bodies. And so by decreasing melanin synthesis or the ability to synthesize melanin in your body, Lyme is cutting you off from the ability to create DC electric current from the sun. And it's increasing the ability to burn and things like this. So you're not able to harvest everything that you can. So Lyme keeps you in a metabolic state of winter. It cuts you off from the light of the sun. And it also dims the light inside you. It does this because it suppresses reactive oxygen species production. And reactive oxygen species, we tend to think of, oh, those are bad, those are free radicals, but they're essential for cellular signaling and communication. And so reactive oxygen species lead for the ability of biophotons to be emitted, which is the light inside you happening at ultraviolet and infrared ends of the spectrum. So with suppressed reactive oxygen species, you have suppressed biophoton emission. So they're just trying to paint this picture of how Lyme literally keeps you in the dark. It cuts you off from the sun. It lowers your biophoton emission. It keeps you in the winter. And that is, when I put this together and learned this, a lot of help from people like Dr. Jack Kruse, it made perfect sense for the first time, because that is what Lyme disease feels like on an emotional level, on a physical level, on a spiritual level, on a nervous system level. And so you can be doing all of the right things and taking all of the right treatments. But if you don't focus on this switch to switch back your ability to turn the lights back on, to be able to reconnect back with the light, it's not going to work. And you're going to keep dealing with chronic illness. And so what does this mean? Well, what can you do about it? There are two wavelengths of light that are particularly important that I would like to share. The first is 380 nanometer light, which is ultraviolet A radiation. UVA, when it strikes our skin, releases hydrogen peroxide. That hydrogen peroxide is able to activate specific enzymes which increase the level of calcium inside your cells. That calcium will be integrated with the cytoskeleton of our T cells to enable them to basically change their cellular structure to reach out and grab things or pull themselves along. So it increases their motility. So that is to say that UVA, this 380 nanometer light, increases the motility of our T cells, making them more effective at catching and killing pathogens in the body. And so they require this input. That specific wavelength of light is also the switch from AMPK to mTOR. So if you're somebody with Lyme, you need to switch those lights back on. You need to get under UVA light in order to activate that switch. And then 1280 nanometer light, which is in the infrared spectrum, is what modulates reactive oxygen species. So if in chronic Lyme, you actually have a suppression of reactive oxygen species, and you focus on switching back mTOR and creating more, which are required for biophoton emission, for example, then you want to modulate things, right? You can't go overboard. You can't have too little or too much. So 1280 nanometer is what modulates the reactive oxygen species in the body. So that combination of light, which is essentially only available from the sun, is really, really critical for dealing with Lyme and Lyme-related infections.
That's so interesting. It's like Lyme is like, it's like the apex predator of our time, of our all of the deficiencies that we've created in our environment, in our social structures, in our spiritual life, in our nervous system, in the way that we relate to ourselves and other people, has been infused into this confounding, terrible, parasitically transmitted disease.
Yeah, you just,
gosh, my head is exploding.
It's terrible. But you just said something really important, which was the environment. It is really the environment that we have created for ourselves that enables the activation of this disease. It does not have to be a disease. The body has mechanisms for taking care of things on its own. But what have we done to our indoor environments? Well, we've completely blocked ourselves from UV because we've villainized UV. So we're creating winter time-like conditions for the body. We're creating the AMPK state, reducing our ability to have melanin and everything. We are also increasing the amount of blue light, which is just increasing cortisol and stress hormones and blood glucose. So our body gets switched on into a glucose-conserving winter-like state because we've eliminated the UV and just increased blue. Whereas that's very similar to what Lyme is doing. And likewise, non-native electromagnetic frequencies like 5G have been shown to interrupt the body's ability to produce melanin. So again, Lyme and non-native EMF are doing the same thing. So if you're inundated with a blue light environment, if you're inundated by non-native EMF, and then you get these pathogens, which are nearly ubiquitous, at least Lyme is these days, and Babesia is increasing. So you've set yourself up for, now they have a position to thrive because they're doing all these same things. This is the conditions in the body that they need to be activated and cause disease. So the light is really critical, from Lyme disease to light.
Wow. It's just incredible the way you explain it, that to think about Lyme mimicking all of the worst effects of the technology environment that we put our bodies in on a 24/7 basis.
Absolutely. And we know blue light activates a photoreceptor called encephalopsin. And encephalopsin specifically reduces the activity of alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. So reduces our ability to tan. So without the UV, that increases alpha MSH activity and melanin synthesis. And with an excess of blue, we're really creating problems for the body.
Right. We're like, it's not just we're like cutting off an essential resource. We're actually accelerating the body's inability to do what it's supposed to do, like in an asymmetric fashion.
Right. Right. And if you think about these natural light changes we go through, like winter, well, yes, there is less UV, while that blue remains pretty much consistent. But you can't compare it to the indoor environments that we've made, because now we've also removed all the infrared. So when we say that we've created a situation for like winter-like activity in the body from the light and EMF environment, it's putting a bad name to winter in that it's actually even far, far worse.
Wow. That's incredible. I've like, what an extraordinary way to look at it. And I hope that your work is spread far and wide. I know there are so many people suffering with all kinds of autoimmune and especially Lyme, that, to hear it from somebody who has been there and also has such a profound understanding of potential healing strategies, it's really incredible. So you have created Regenerative Intelligence. It is available. You can consult with physicians or offer coaching to individuals. Tell us, sort of give me, like, if it was up to Tim, what would your vision be for a decentralized health and education system? Because those two things work together, I think. Like, what can we be aiming for?
Mm-hmm. I think it starts with early education. I would love to be able to see the opportunity for our children to learn about the ways that light affects their health. I would love for them to see the importance of water and mitochondria, and how the water you make inside you is even more important than the water you drink. I'd love for children to be able to learn the importance of darkness just as much as light and circadian rhythms. So I think it's somewhat unfair that we're thrown into the world without any education or understanding of how our bodies actually work. Right. And then it's unfair to these children that, they're having attention deficit disorder problems and hyperactivity, and then we just drug them because we don't know how to deal with it. So I would like to see it addressed from an early education, because if we're armed with an understanding of how our bodies actually operate and interact with the environment around us, then for the rest of our lives, we can make informed decisions about what environmental inputs to put in or not. And those environmental inputs are going to determine the outputs of our life.
Love it. Any other thoughts or anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap?
My last thought is just that I'm going to be continuing this Lyme research. Jack Cruz kind of gave me a list of tons of things to read to go through. I'm like researching and integrating as much as I can. Grateful for that. So I'm not an expert, but I am on a continuous learning experience and synthesizing all that I can. So in the future, I would like to put together a Lyme guide that looks at Lyme disease, yes, from the biochemical understanding of everything that we know and the co-infections, but also looking at things through the quantum biology lens and the involvement of light and everything I talked about. So I'd like to make that a free resource available on my website, regenerant.com. So people can keep an eye open for that. In the meantime, I have a circadian optimization guide that people can download for free as well. And this is almost 20 pages of free education explaining what our circadian rhythms are, how our circadian biology works. And then so people can go into the science as much as they want, but then there's also just practical, tell me what to do. Here's a daily checklist that's available for them too, as well as lists of resources for things like blue blockers that might support their journey. So people can go, feel free to download that as well. And I'm just excited to keep on this journey because it's been incredibly eye-opening for me, and it's been life-changing for me in my health. And I really get a lot of fulfillment when I'm able to share this information with other people and then see how it helps them too. Because it's one thing to apply it to yourself and feel so much better, and then it's another to get the experience of being able to see it helping other people as well. And so I'm really getting a lot of fulfillment out of doing that, and I'm just excited to continue learning and growing in this space.
Well, I'm so glad that you are. And I love that you don't consider yourself an expert in Lyme and quantum biology, because as far as I can tell, you might not have a PhD in it, but that's only because it doesn't exist. Your expertise is much appreciated. And, I love that we live in a world where we can choose to develop our expertise in any area that we need to, as you are doing. So thank you for your huge contribution to this field. I'm so excited. I really think that, your focus on this particular disease could have some really radically effective effects in the world. And I'm excited to see that happen. So thanks, Tim.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And to you personally, I'm incredibly grateful. I didn't mention, but I also did take the certification program through the Institute of Applied Quantum Biology. Love to the program. And that's all thanks to you and all the hard work you're doing and all the amazing people you invite to this podcast. So it's really an honor. And you are a part of my journey as well. So I just want to extend my thanks to everything that you're doing.
Oh, thank you, Tim. I really appreciate it. Let's keep doing stuff. It's fun. Woohoo! You made it to the end of another episode. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploratory adventure into new realms. Your energy and support are building a different world, and I am so grateful to be on this journey with you. Take care, and thanks.